Our next speaker is Dr. Veronica Miller. She's from the UC Berkeley School of Public Health at the UC DC campus. She's a professor in the Division of Infectious Diseases and Vaccinology and the executive director of the Forum for Collaborative Research. And she will be talking to us about the PSC Forum, updates and future directions. Thank you.
So thank you very much. And again, Ricky and the whole board and the group organizing this conference for inviting me back. So it's an honor to be back here and give you some updates about what we're up to with the PSC Forum. So the concept of the Forum for Collaborative Research is that we have one table that brings together regulators, industry, academia, and patients, and anyone else who has a stake in research for PSC. And the regulators, we include the US FDA, we include the European agency, the EMA, and we also have been working with Health Canada, and more recently we've begun to engage the China FDA as well. And by bringing everybody to one table, we basically can increase the efficiency of drug development because we bring clarity, we allow more innovation and collaboration to happen. And we decrease the uncertainty that is associated with a regulatory pathway. If a sponsor, if an industry, a company doesn't know what the regulatory path is going to be, they're less likely to be willing to invest their resources in that. And so our guiding principle is that once we have something that's identified that might work, a drug candidate or a therapeutic strategy, their efficient and safe development is in the best interest of all stakeholders, but most of all the patients. And it's really, and this is something I feel very strongly about, unless you do clinical research efficiently and use data to the maximum, you're not doing ethical research. So we talk about accelerating drug development, not by lowering the scientific standards, but by increasing the efficiency through collaboration. So we provide a non-competitive, safe environment, independence, transparency, information democracy. Everyone in the room hears the same information, and this allows for synergy versus duplication. So the normal regulatory path, which will still be in place, is basically a single sponsor meets with a single agency. These are confidential meetings, and they discuss the development plan and changes to it, etc. And what we provide is a platform where all the sponsors can be in the room together with multiple agencies. And that really means that everyone learns from the experience. And so that this kind of interaction then with all sponsors and multiple agency in the room will then feed back into how a single sponsor interacts with a single agency. So as a result of that, we can allow the evolving science to develop into evolving consensus, and we can generate better evidence more efficiently by using data as efficiently as possible. We really can focus on mechanisms for patient-centered drug development and mechanisms for innovation and data use and analytics. So the Forum for Collaborative Research, we have several disease areas. We have the Liver Forum, we have the PSC Forum, the HIV Forum is still active. We have an HBV Forum, a CMV Forum, and transplantation. We had an HCV Forum, but that one we basically closed because the drug development issues there have been addressed. We've been asked by the FDA to also consider addressing alcohol-related liver disease. So that's something we are considering, and also we're in the process of launching a Rare Diseases in One Area of Metabolism Forum. All of our disease areas, each forum is guided by a steering committee with academic and industry co-chairs. And I want to point out here specifically that we have Ricky Safer as one of the patient advocacy. So Ricky represents the patient voice, as does Marlene Walmsley from the UK. And I also wanted to point out that we do have Chris Bolas on our steering committee. And so you can see we have the leadership from academia involved, and as well as different industry members. So, and we are sponsored, and I'd like to thank our sponsors. And so this is what our strategy is. We always start with the most urgent questions, and what is something that we could start addressing now? And so basically, once we have those issues identified, we start with multi-stakeholder working groups. As the groups start working together, there's a trust that builds. We allow the consensus to evolve. The consensus has to always be science-based. And we identify knowledge gaps and mechanisms to address the gaps where we can't have consensus. We say, well, what data do we need to be able to answer that question? And so we repeat that process over and over again, and of course, then we can also tackle more challenging issues. I wanted to spend just a little bit time on regulatory perspectives, and I'm sure you've all know about the US FDA. You may also know a little bit about other agencies around the world. But I wanted to kind of really talk a little bit about what it is they need to do and what it is they need to know if they are going to be presented with the question, should we approve this drug or not? And it's all based on benefit risk. And unfortunately, benefit risk is not a formula. It will be so dependent on who you are, who the group is, what other treatments might be available. So it's a very, I don't want to say gray area, it's actually a very multicolored area. It's all the colors of the rainbow that are between black and white. It's not black and white, it's very colorful. So really the questions we ask, what do we know about the benefit of the treatment? How do we measure that benefit? So that's when we talk about endpoints. It's how do we measure the benefit of the treatment? And we also want to know how long will the benefit last? Is it something that's going to give you a little bit more life or a little bit better quality of life, or is it something that's going to cure you completely, etc.? And then what do we know about the risk? And by risk, we mean potential harms. And again, how do we measure this? And when could the harm appear? How serious is the harm? Is it something you could address just with a blood transfusion, or if you lower your, if you're sort of, one of the side effects might be anemia, and then you might be able to deal with that. If it's a headache, you can deal with that. If it's diarrhea, you may be able to tolerate it. But if it causes other long-term effects that are very serious, then you would think about it very differently. And then the question really is, what is the tolerance for risk? And that is a question that every patient, every physician, every regulator needs to ask themselves. How much risk are we willing to tolerate for the benefit that we might get? So these are the thinkings that a regulator needs to address. And so we need to then provide that information to them so that they can make a decision. And from our last PSC forum meeting, this was just an update slide from our colleagues from the FDA, that's the US regulatory agencies, and they talked about the different types of endpoints. I will go through this kind of quickly, but certainly happy to talk more about that later. And, but specifically for PSC, when we talk about a surrogate endpoint, we really mean something that we can measure before the final endpoint. So we want something that will predict. We don't want to measure whether you need a liver transplant. We want something that we can say, this predicts if you need a liver transplant, right? And that's easier to measure and it's non-invasive. So where we are at in the regulatory thinking today for PSC, basically there's no single biomarker that is a clear standalone candidate, but there is basically a combination that we can think about. So the FDA is, and I missed that slide here, basically considers alkaline phosphatase as a marker, but not a standalone marker. And what that other marker or markers might be is something we need to work on. Now, similarly, from the European perspective, here again, we have the combination of alkaline phosphatase and histology can be used as a surrogate endpoint. But how do we evaluate ALP and histology? Will it be combined, or is there one that's more important than the other, etc.? And they have all kinds of questions. I don't want to go into detail here, but just to illustrate what a regulatory person thinks about when they think about how are they going to look at the data you provide to them. And I did want to point out, for example, how long would the study have to last? How long do you need to continue the study when you get conditional licensing, for example? And the other thing I wanted to point out here, that there's a very clear yes for the possibility of licensing a treatment that would be a symptomatic treatment only. That's not interfering with the disease process, but would be ameliorating some of the symptoms. So that kind of gives you the idea of where we are now. And so what the PSC Forum does, it takes this information, and we always have the regulators and industry and patients and academicians at the table, and we say, okay, so where do we need to go next to answer and bring more clarity into what are the other biomarkers going to be, along with alkaline phosphatase, for example. So one of the things we noticed that was pointed out was that the inclusion criteria for trials was not really very standardized and maybe not always as logical as it needed to be. So under our work stream for clinical trials, we have one on inclusion, a working group on inclusion and exclusion criteria. And at the last steering committee meeting, we decided that we wanted to start another one that looks at ALP fluctuations. What you mean when you say improvement, or what you mean when you say it gets worse, and how does that relate to liver stiffness, for example. We have a work stream that is centered on patient-centered clinical research that talks about PRO tools, and then we have another area that we look at that has to do with data and data use. So for the inclusion and exclusion working group, for example, what is the role in a trial if you have underlying IBD? Is that an exclusion criterion, or will you take people that have that? What about concomitant therapies such as anti-inflammatories? What about URSO use? And how does this relate to the target of the drug? Some of these might be more important if the drug targets one aspect of the many targets that Chris Bolus just showed us, than others. And again, with patient populations, what kind of patient populations are we talking about? The small duct, the large duct, etc. And this was Gideon Hirschfeld, who spoke at our last PSC forum, where he summarized the discussions of this group. And I thought this was a very good summary. So we have the patient populations. So are they on UDCA? Are they have IBD plus or minus medication? Do they have secondary cholangitis, for example? What is the mechanism of action? And then what kind of endpoint are we measuring? So this group is continuing their discussion, and we'll come up with some recommendation. We had a short-term working group on PROs. And it was really an exercise about saying what's out there, what are people doing, and are there any gaps we need to be addressing. And I'm using this one to illustrate how these working groups come together. So we have Ricky and Martine. We have from academia, Doug Thorburn from the Royal Free in the UK. And then we have the various industry members and the regulatory authorities involved. And I wanted to show this slide because we also had, for this group, we had Michelle Campbell join us. Now, she is one of the experts at the FDA on patient-reported outcomes, not in any specific disease area, but overall. So she could really inform the group about what the requirements are. And many of you know that Gilead has published a paper, the Development Validation PROs instrument, and so it's very nice that they were willing to share it with everyone so everyone can learn from that. PROs is really a very sticky field, and it's not an easy one if you don't have the experience. And then I'm coming to data and data use. And as we just heard from Dr. Bolas, there's a lot of very excellent work going on amongst registry and databases. And how can we help build synergy in this area? So one of the things we have done, and Jessica Weber, our project manager, and Rachel Gomel have worked very hard on this. On our website, we have a link to PSC databases and registries. And this is basically just an information source. So that we invite all of the registries to have their information up here so that if someone says, I want to look at a registry or collaborate with somebody, all that information is in one place. So this is simply information, and I'm using the PSC Partners Patient Registry as an example. That was the first one that was posted. Khalid is on there as well. So it has a little bit about what the registry is and then what kinds of information is being collected. So anyone can just go here, and it's purely informational to serve the field. But we also need to look at what are the data gaps. We have a lot of very excellent work going on, but what data do we need specifically to meet regulatory purposes? Most regulatory decisions are made on the basis of randomized clinical trials, but how do we have observational studies and registries inform that process? And the FDA now is very interested in turning real-world data into real-world evidence that they can use for their decision-making. So what we need to do, obviously, is identify the right surrogate endpoints, but then those endpoints need to be validated. And there will be some regulatory criteria that will be very important. So how can we take the work that's already going on and really adapt it amongst everyone to really make sure that we can get to this point where we can say the FDA and the EMA will be able to rely on this data. So what we want to do there is really build the synergies amongst the existing efforts. And we thank, again, Dr. Chris Bellows for being part of this effort. And in terms of potential other working groups, we start them as needed, and then when the work is done, we finish them and we move on to other ones. We've talked a lot about, in the steering committee, about non-invasive diagnostics and imaging. How do we apply that to PSC? There's been a lot of discussion about the need to start a pediatric working group. And also, we have been thinking about, can we work on symptom management? How do we have clinical trials about symptom management that then fit into the overall picture? And I put itch in capital letters here because last night there was a lot of discussion about that. And there are some developed endpoints to measure improvement in itch, but it might be worthwhile to just review those and see if there's anything else that we can do. So with that, I'd like to really thank Jessica, who is sitting in the back there, who is the project manager for the PSC Forum, and of course all the other forum staff that works in the office, and we really work as a team, and of course the PSC Forum Steering Committee and the overall members of the PSC Forum, and of course our sponsors. Thank you.